Hello everybody to this new Pix4D webinar, which is about the index calculator and more precisely about precision agriculture meets Pix4D mapper. I'd like to welcome everybody on this new webinar. So my name is Oliver Kung and one of the co-founders of Pix4D. And the agenda of today is going to be divided in first a theoretical approach where I'm going to explain some very basic concepts about remote sensing, but which are very much more related to the way Pix4D mapper handles the data than the way that really the whole agronomy is working. Then I'm going to show step by step how to create a project when you have a single sensor in Pix4D mapper and how to extract potentially NDVI from it, and also present a way to create project when you have multiple camera in your UAV on multiple UAVs. I'll go then a bit more in detail on how to compute NDVI indices and also other type of indices directly in Pix4D mapper. I'll then finish with some use cases from our users which have shown really good results using our tool and for remote sensing in agriculture, and a little summary at the end to really put all the information back into something as a take-home message. All right, let's start. Remote sensing. The goal of the remote sensing is basically to do a quantitative measure of the vegetation using a sensor, which is basically, in our case, a camera. As we are going to see just in a few slides, an image is generated from many different factors that influence the end result in the pixel. One of them is how the sun is illuminating a scene, then how it goes on an object and bounce back, in that case would be a plant, and then how the sensor is interpreting this data. And all of them have a big inference and need to be carefully explained and modeled. But the most important thing, and which is the reason why we are doing all this work with cameras, is that the reflectance contains information about the plant. In which respect? Maybe the easiest message to go through is that a plant has chlorophyll, and the plant with more chlorophyll, which means usually a more healthy plant, will have two big effects. The first one, it will absorb more red, and in with certain respects some blue, than an unhealthy plant. This is basically the photosynthesis, which is taking the energy from the sun to transform it into a process useful for the plant. On the other hand, which is also an interesting fact, is it reflects more near infrared energy than an unhealthy plant. These two sentences can be quite nicely visualized in the graph above there. Basically, you've got the blue, green, red, and infrared. The blue and the red will be absorbed here to provide the photosynthesis. So a good plant, a plant in a good health, which will probably absorb most of the red and the blue and only bounce back the green. And in addition, a healthy plant will let go through the infrared up to the epidermis here and will bounce it back, which is also another sign that the plant is healthy. Now, instead of talking about blue, green, red, and infrared, these are all properties of the spectrum of the wavelengths. So if we look in this graph where we plot a lot of these different wavelengths, only a little portion is visible, and in this little visible portion, you can see the effect of the green, blue, and red channel. Basically, this would be the green, in the middle, which bounce back, so you can actually see some energy in return, the blue, which is absorbed, and the red, which is also absorbed for healthy plants. However, as soon as you move a little bit in the near infrared range, you can see that for a healthy plant, there's a lot of reflected infrared wavelengths. So we can also summarize it as a very easy thing, is that the reflectance, how much light bounce back from a plant is actually related to the health and to the quantity of chlorophyll and some other things in the plant. Now let's go a bit deeper into what's an image and what's the relationship between the sun, the plant, the camera, and the final image you get. So basically, an image in JPEG, TIFF format, anything, comes from a process that involves three main factors, as I said in the beginning. You'll have the sun producing wavelengths, which is going to go reflect on an object which has certain property, and this will be captured by a camera. All this taken together will put some value to the pixel. In that case, it's going to be a green pixel. Now, in the introduction, I just said that what matters for what's related to the health and the chlorophyll in a plant is not the image, it's the reflectance. And you can, from easy math, find out that is a bit a simplified model, but if you take the image and you remove the influence that has the sensor and the influence that has the illumination, you will basically be able to get back the reflectance value. And from the reflectance value, you can then derive how healthy the plant is. And this is the whole challenge that is faced, and that Pix4D Mapper is going to basically help you a lot to automatically do a lot of smart processing behind to make sure that all these important factors are well considered and taken in account. Let's start with the illumination, which is, in most of the cases, the sun. The first thing to know about the sun is that it emits at many different wavelengths, but not with equal power for each of them. As you can see in the graph there, short wavelengths are actually emitting more power than long wavelengths. And this is not always constant. This is going to change with the clouds, the atmosphere condition, with the time of the day. And the amount of power that the sun is going to give in the red, green, blue, and infrared channel is not always going to be constant. So importantly, when you want to do measurements from these values, one of the first things is to model, is to quantify how much sun is in your images. The best way to do so is using a direct illumination sensor. Usually, this is a camera which is pointing towards the sun and which is on board the UAV. If such a sensor is there, and we support different type of sensors like that, then Pix4D Mapper will take this information in consideration in the whole processing to remove the effect of the sun on the final image. That's not the only way to do it, to remove the effect of the sun. The other way would basically be to analyze the spectrum using a reflectant pattern on the ground, which is usually a Teflon disc because of its very nice properties, with uniform and known reflectance. What you would do then is go in the image, find this point, click on it to tell that this is a place with known reflectance, and then this can be used to relatively estimate the spectrum. It's not as good as doing it with a sensor, but it already provides some more benefits. This is not currently done in Pix4D Mapper, but you can use basically pre-processing software, which is normally specifically designed for your camera and your images, in which you can do that. If you take more like a consumer-grade camera, and when it produces a JPEG images, let's say, inside of it there's a chip which will try to estimate also the spectrum, but only using image content. And this is a process which is called white balancing. Every camera do it. However, it's a very, very rough estimate. And for the type of measurements we do, when we want to analyze NDVI from your images, this can be somehow and sometimes way too off the reality, and this can produce errors in your measurements. Now the next big part which needs to be modeled to make sense of the whole of a proper NDVI is the sensor. There are many sensors out there and they have very, very different properties. The first and most obvious is that a camera is capturing different wavelength range depending on the sensor configuration and depending on how many bands it will gather information about each wavelength. Let's see the first example up there. This is a normal RGB sensor, a normal camera. The camera will capture in the blue channel wavelengths from 400 to, let's say, 500 something, the green from here to here, and the red from here to here. Now, this is very good because this is pretty much the same that we have in our human brain, so this helps a lot to understand correctly and to make sense of imagery. Let's look at the bottom graph. This graph is basically the same response as what I've shown in the very beginning of the presentation. This basically tells for a leaf how is the absorption done at different wavelengths. And in the first set of wavelengths, this is going to give you only information about leaf pigment, basically the chlorophyll in the leaves. And the RGB camera stops there and doesn't contain any information about infrared. That's why basically you need to have a modified camera or specific sensor which is going to also take information in this part. The most two common camera that can be seen usually in the industry are from modified camera are the green, red near infrared. This would be this one, which basically is able, if you look bottom there, to get some information on the reflectance of the infrared, which should be very high if it's a healthy plant, and on the absorption of the red channel, which is the photosynthesis, which should be very low if the plant is healthy. However, there's plenty of other type of measurements you can do, and usually you have a data sensor for this type of things. So, for example, whoops, I clicked too quickly. For example, the red edge camera is going to look a bit more at different part of the spectrum, and the proper multispectral camera is going to be very nicely going to analyze the bands in a very nice spatial resolution, wavelength resolution. This is one of the aspects. So which type of bands and how are they configured, and this will have a big influence on what you can measure. To compute an NDVI the most classical way, this camera would be pretty good, as it will give you a good response in the red and a response also in the infrared. However, as you can see, the response is not the same, the amount of response. That's why you need also to characterize the camera. A characterized camera is something you can do in a lab using special tools, and this information can also be used by Pix4D mapper to correctly adjust the values to process very relevant values. Another thing that influences a lot the processing is the exposure, aperture, and ISO settings of your camera. As soon as you change them, this will have a big impact on the intensity of the image of the reflectance you obtain. And indeed, it will definitely be, it's important. However, Pix4D Mapper is also able to read your exposure, aperture, and ISO information and correct for it during the generation of the reflectance map if this information is available in EXIF data, which is for most consumer-grade camera. Finally, there is also some effects from the lens configuration, basically the amount of light which is perceived by the sensor coming frontally in it versus coming from the edge is not the same. The response will be much higher when the ray goes directly through the center of the sensor than from the side. This will also affect the values, and this needs also to be modeled. This type of modeling, again, can be also characterized in a lab environment with specific tools, and this can also be given to Pix4D Mapper to correct for this, let's say, imperfection of the sensor. Okay, so now we got the big picture. You've got the sun, which can be modeled using sensors, which is going to bounce on the plant, and the plant is going to give information to the sensor, which can be again also modeled. So you can remove, basically you can model and remove the influence of the camera and the sun to get the true reflectance map. In addition, Pix4D Mapper will make sure to compute correctly the incidence and outbound angles during the 3D processing to correctly adjust for them and to take them nicely in account. It's already pretty complicated, but it's actually even more complicated. This is true for a simple leaf which is on the ground. However, your plant is going to be usually much more complex. For NDVI calculation, what I just said is normally enough to get really good values. However, your plants, if you want to extract more information than just the NDVI index, but more information about the health status, about the chlorophyll content, and so on, the leaf area index, you can, but this requires really very carefully modeling of the illumination, the sensor response, the plant geometry, and the type of the plant. I'm going to talk about this just at the end. Now, I'm talking about the reflectance map and not about an orthomosaic, and there's a reason behind that. Potentially, it's very much the same. However, there's a big difference, and this big difference is that the reflectance map is optimized for radiometric accuracy, as the orthomosaic is optimized for aesthetic quality, file size, speed. Pix4D Mapper is indeed, as previously said, able and will model and correct the illumination and the sensor. It's going to do that for as many cameras as possible, but we are working very closely with camera manufacturers to have for certain camera a very easy workflow to make it work as nicely as possible. Also, something to remember is that some of this processing can be done as a pre-processing step. For example, Tetracam is offering a tool to allow the correction of the sensor and of the illumination before processing them. I've been talking a lot about radiometric content, but that's not the only thing that matters. Geometrical accuracy is also incredibly important when you do this type of measurement. And the good news is that Pix4D Mapper is able and will align correctly each pixel of each original images. What this means is that when you have sufficient overlap, usually in most of the pixels will be seen by between 3 and 50 measurements. So each end result pixel of the reflectance map is going to be originated for so many images that were available at the beginning. And this has two main good factors. Is using that we can reduce the noise of the sensor. And the second big advantage is that we can also model some small variation in illumination. Say that there was a little cloud passing by. Potentially, if we've got enough measurements, we can disregard this cloud passing by as being an outlier, and that's what Pix4D Mapper is going to do by default. However, please also note that if you've got huge difference in illumination during taking the data sets, even with an illumination sensor, it's going to be very difficult to get good results. The other big importance in geometrical accuracy is the georeferencing, especially temporal georeferencing. What I mean by that is if you have RTK GPS on the ground and you use 3 ground control points on the ground, you can do the first flight, and 1 or 2 weeks later you can fly again in several and you can repeat this measurement every week. Thanks to the 3 ground control points that you inserted there and that you can see in every dataset, you can geometrically make sure that every pixel will be aligned perfectly one on each other. If you don't have RTK GPS, you can also use just virtual ground control points. By this, I mean that you can go in the first dataset, find 3 areas you can easily identify in the next temporal time, take the measurement from them from Pix4D Mapper itself, and use these 3 measurements and repeat them in the next dataset. This way you can be sure that you will have a nicely aligned set of temporal reflectance maps and NDVI. This is a nice slide which basically shows elevation map. So this is not an NDVI. This is a purely 3D elevation map computed from imagery. I did here a line which is basically a profile. This profile is you can visualize it here on the bottom. This profile basically is a vineyard. So you can see that if your sensor is has enough megapixel, is precise enough, you can determine the nice 3D of your plants. And in that case, you can easily see that the vineyard was nicely modeled, each line after each other. And you can even deduce the terrain below it. Precise 3D information is very important because your imagery is never going to be at low altitude with UAV, and that's a big difference with traditional photogrammetry, is you're going to be much lower in altitude. If you're lower in altitude, you will have more perspective, and if you have more perspective, let's imagine that your camera is right there and shooting, taking a picture in this direction. If we wouldn't model the nice 3D position of with the DSM, we would mistake the pixel for another value, and they will not be nicely aligned, and you will start doing mistake when computing your NDVI. So having a very precise 3D model behind, which is also computed automatically by Pix4D Mapper, is extremely important when doing accurate level of plans type of NDVI. Okay, so now that was quite a bit of theory. Now let's go a bit more into practice. Here we are now talking about a single sensor, and I will show the steps on how to process using Pix4D Mapper a data set taken by, in that case, it's going to be a tetracam camera. So If you have a modified consumer camera, that would be a camera in which you move the filter or that you change a little bit the filter settings, it's very good, but you have to be warned that if you didn't characterize it and if you didn't model the illuminant, it's the white balancing going to do most of the computation, and the results you will obtain are very likely to be relatively correct, but absolutely it cannot be guaranteed that it will be perfectly correct. If you use a special sensor, then we can already model many more things, like the illumination and the sensor, and we can already guarantee to have much more accurate type of results. So let's go and let's open a project. Oops. In that example, you can see a data set taken with a quadcopter, or air-lapse copter, together with tetracam camera. And you can see that from this example, the overlap is very high between each images. The overlap will depend on the sensor quality, the sensor size, but as most of Pix4D processing, you can expect to require overlap between 60 and up to 90%, depending on the difficulty and the type of sensor and the altitude. I'll go through the steps of creating a project from scratch and show you then the final output you can get from it. So let's open Pix4D Mapper. You go in Project, New Project, and you type a name, NDVI test. Very important for most of the cameras which are going to be used for agriculture is to use this alternative processing mode. This alternative processing mode is much more robust in the case of fields and in case of vegetation. So we really recommend to use this mode. However, you will need a good georeferencement, but that's very often the case. Okay, let's click on Next. I'm going to import my images. In that case, I have 400 images. Preferably, you would need to have TIFF images. In TIFF images, you can have a lot more content, and the data is much better preserved. However, you can also use JPEG images, which offer a bit of an approximation, which can also be processed and most of the time produce very successful NDVI. Okay, then you need to import the geolocation file, which is usually provided by your UAV, and which in this case is right not in this, I don't have in my project. But you would need basically to introduce your position file here to have the geotags. It would indeed be an advantage to import the raw picture files, but there are way too many cameras which exist right now with different type of formats. So what we do is we let the camera manufacturers provide an export from RAW to TIFF, which is almost not destructive in terms of information, and Pix4D Mapper is able to read the full 16-bit TIFF information to process it correctly in the further tool of events. Something very important is the camera model, and I'm going to underline that, as this is one of the major source of errors with customers. In the camera parameters, you need to make sure that the band selection is done correctly. In my case, I know that the camera I've been using has this type of band order: near-infrared, red, and green. And you have different type of choices there. This will have a big influence on how the key points will be computed and how successful your project is going to be. So please make sure at every project of infrared is with some part of infrared imagery that you use the correct order of bands. Then you would click next and you would finish the processing and start the processing. I'm going to give you also another tip, again related to imagery from sensors which are very specialized for agriculture. Many sensors specialized for agriculture are not very accurate on a geometrical point of view. Most of the time it's because of a rolling shutter to maximize the amount of lights that goes into the sensor. But this, when moving the UAV on a high speed and a low altitude, very often this provides distortions in the images. Pix4D Mapper is able to handle most of this distortion, but for that you will need to go into processing options, make sure that the alternative mode is checked in, and in the optimization make sure that it's not on optimize externals and all internals, but only on optimize externals and leading internals. This improves a lot the robustness of the calibration with cameras which do not have perfect geometry. You can then start the processing and do the 3 steps. It's going to automatically do the 3 steps of the processing. Basically the initial, which is the calibration, the point cloud, which is going to be the 3D model, and the orthomosaic. In that case, after the processing, you can see that all the cameras were nicely placed and recovered in 3D position, and that we also generated a 3D model of the terrain. Now you can, as soon as the point cloud is generated, you can open the index calculator, which is right there on this button. The index calculator is going to show you, at first will be totally blank because the reflectance map needs to be computed. The reflectance map can be computed at any resolution which is required. In that case, I choose 10 centimeters and click on generated. As soon as this reflectance map is going to be computed, you will have the values of the different bands which will appear in this table. From there, you can decide which formula to apply. By default, the software is going to provide you a list of possible indices. However, you can do your own and decide on your own formula by clicking on index list, add, and there you get access to the formula editor in which you can decide to make your own formula. For example, if I wanted to make NDVI, a green NDVI, I could take the formula of I could basically choose the near-infrared channel minus the green divided by the near-infrared plus the green. So you can basically put any type of formula for all the bands which are available there on the table. As soon as you decided on which band you want to use, you click on Generate. As soon as Generate has finished doing the computation, it will generate a one-band image, which is then visualized in a color map. This is a very standard remote sensing tool. You can see this map, this color index map, as a way to categorize your NDVI indices into several values. In our case, we can decide to map everything which goes from 0.12 to 0.20 into red. Oops, I have several anchors there. I'm just going to reset it. It's going to be easier to visualize. Okay. So basically here I created 3 classes. One class which goes from 0.12 to the value over there, which is going to be into green values, and another class which goes from the value 0.36 to 0.25, which is going to give another color. And this way I managed to find similar pattern in the NDVI and find out that there was some relationship basically here, probably something, you've got some unhealthy plants or some soil, and there you got some more healthy plants over there. Yeah. So just to summarize, I took my images, I put in the software. The software was smart enough to detect many of the properties of the cameras. However, you need to make sure that also some of them need to be hand selected to make sure that the processing will be done correctly, such as for this specific camera, the right band order, and because of the slow rolling shutter, some options which are specific to solve this problem. And at the end, you can get automatically an NDVI index, and to visualize it and to separate it into different categories for the colors. A bit more advanced, you can also use multiple sensor in the same project to compensate if your single sensor is not able to provide infrared and red, which is the 2 ingredients needed for NDVI map. So for example, what you could do is to put 2 cameras on a UAV, one which would be a RGB camera, and the other would be an infrared, green and blue. Basically, you would take the red channel of the camera which provides RGB, and you would take the near-infrared of the camera, of the second camera, which does infrared, green, blue. To do so, I will quickly go into the different steps and then show them. The first thing is that you need to set, during the creation of the camera, different group for each camera. This will let the software know that it's different type of channels that should not be interpreted together and merged together. In a very specific case where you use the same camera model, but one with the infrared filter and one without, there's a small workaround to be done, which is creating 2 individual projects and then finally merge them together using the merge feature of Pix4D Mapper. What will happen is that for each group, there will be an individual reflectance map computed, and they can be used then together to be to compute NDVI maps. If you are using 2 cameras which are displaying this effect of slow rolling shutter, use the same trick in the options that I described earlier on the which option to select to have a successful processing. Let's have an example of this one. Okay, here in this field you can see that this field was flown actually twice, each time with a different camera. So one with a RGB and the other with a near-infrared GB camera. In the image property editor, you need to make sure that the group is different for the two sets of the camera. As a small trick, if you need to rename a group, you can set any name. So let's say that this would be RGB2. You can select the column, press on the control key to select multiple images, on the shift to make a big selection, and then you can replace multiple values with one single click. That's just a little trick. Again, as previously, make sure that each camera have the right band order. So we have here RGB, and the other one was an infrared GB. You can then start the processing, and as a result, you will see that you will get each camera processed together in the same dataset. You can also view for if there are some problems in your field. You can use the 3D to basically also detect that. And in the index calculator, you can see now that instead of 3, there are 6 bands. 3 bands coming from the first camera and 3 bands coming from the second camera. In the index list, you can create your own formula which can use some parts of the first camera and some parts of the second camera to compute correctly your formula. In that case, I would use the first band of the infrared camera and the first band of the RGB camera to compute my NDVI. Then again, it produces an index map, and this X map can be recolored using this tool to set different group of very similar materials which is reacting the same way. Interpreting this type of data requires experience and very often needs to be correlated with some samples in the ground, especially if your data is not absolutely right, which means that if you're not using a wide sensor and the characterization of your camera, it's going to be very hard to have a really quantify what the value means. It's going to be much more a relative appreciation, which is going to give you what's around, what are similar patterns happening in your farm. Okay, let's talk now about 2 different use cases which were reported by our Pix4D mapper users. One is from clients in Nipissing University, Canada, which used a Tetracam ADC, which has green, red, and near-infrared channel in one single camera. So to compute the NDVI map, you can basically take the third channel and subtract the first channel and do the math there. So you have everything you need in one single camera. They used the tools provided by Tetracam to correctly adjust for the characterization of the camera and for the sensor. And they've been doing experiments where they've been with some clients of them to basically see the influence of certain fertilizer on a field, and it correlated perfectly with the yield which was obtained at the end of the year. So the first one, you can see that the user created 4 categories, and the first field A was obtaining what was displaying a lower NDVI indices than the 2 other one, and indeed was providing much less yield at the end of the year. and was a confirmation that basically this data is correlated to the real crop. Another use case from agribusiness, also in Canada, is using the modified Canon XS, which is a normal camera on which we removed a filter. And as you can see, this is near-infrared green-blue, so it doesn't contain the red. So it could not compute a simple NDVI, but in that case, it was a green NDVI. And this application was about manual application, and the green NDVI indices was already enough to find a correlation between places where no manual was applied and where manual was applied on this field. So let's go in summary. You can compute NDVI from a modified consumer camera. This is a very interesting fact. And in that case, Pix4D will take care of all the geometrical alignment, of most of the radiometric adjustment, and will gather correctly all the data from all the images to make something scientifically about the reflectance of the field, and will also offer you basically the tools to compute and visualize the NDVI and group into category. However, as I also mentioned many times, the sensor has indeed a huge influence, and the way how much knowledge you have about your sensor will have a huge influence in the quality, repeatability, and also additional information you can extract from your imagery, from your infrared imagery. And basically, one of them is with modified consumer camera, you will very often obtain only camera white balance, which is a very simplified sensor and luminance model. So from there, you can improve by basically adding a reflective pattern, adding an illumination sensor, and to send your camera in the lab to have it characterized such that you can really know everything, what's the real response of your camera. Now, the very good news is that Pix4D Mapper has been built to take all this information in consideration and is taking all this information to really improve the quality and relevance of the reflectance map and thus the NDVI. And we are working with multiple integrator camera manufacturers to make sure that with their images and the data provided there, you get all of this accounted while generating the reflectance map. And what we have seen, and we've got, there are many research groups and some commercial companies offering this now, is going into more beyond NDVI and starting to go into further plant modeling, which is now, and thanks to all the imagery and the way it's been correctly processed to give a reflectance map, you can also start generating more scientifically model of exact type of fields you have to get even more information about the chlorophyll, the health, and potentially this will lead to really understand how much more fertilizer or if the plant has any disease. All right, this was then the webinar about the new precision agriculture options which are present in Pix4D Mapper. I'd like to remind that you can get trials by going on Pix4D Mapper website, and you can also visualize all the previous webinars, and also this one will be very soon available on our support website. I also advertise quickly the fact that we have workshops announced in Switzerland where we can answer and we will go through much more understanding of how you can use UAV and any type of other imagery. And with that, I'll also conclude about the next webinar, which will be held in a few weeks, which will be talking about the importance of proper flight planning and all the different ways and how big is the influence of flight planning in modern photogrammetry and specifically in Pix4D Mapper. And this workshop will be, this next webinar will be able to register in a few, normally in a few couple of days. So it was a pleasure again to host this webinar. And again, this webinar will be available in a few days online. And have a very, very good day. And thank you for using Pix4D Mapper. Bye now.